right, well, since we have such a big crowd from all over, let's get started. So I'm Jillian Pressman. I work at YIMBY Action. I'm Director of Development, and wanted to welcome you to our conversation on anti-racism and urbanism. YIMBY Action is a network of pro-housing activists. We're fighting for more inclusive housing policies. And our mission is to drive policy change to increase the supply of housing at all levels and bring down the cost of living in opportunity-rich cities and towns. As we talk, if there's anything that resonates with you, you can go to yimbyaction.org/join and become a member. That's the best way to fuel our movement. So what are we doing here? So this is a series, so YIMBY Action is launching a series of conversations to take the message of the recent uprisings. And our hope with these are to elevate ideas and practices that will help us reimagine how we shape cities and to whose benefit we create that change. We hope this series can help us explore the concept of anti-racism in urbanism. How can the policies of urbanism become a force that tears down institutional racism and reduces the racial wealth gap? How does the urbanist movement address its own history and current participation in upholding white supremacy? Definitely talk about that today. So we won't answer all these questions today, but we hope to get started. And this is a series, so we've had 3 conversations thus far. All of those are available on our YouTube channel. We'll share the link afterwards. And we're actually gonna do more conversations. So we have some other speakers lined up. We'll also have, next week, we're actually gonna, kind of hit pause because we've had 4 great conversations already. And we're actually gonna do a reflection and think about, like, from what we've seen around these conversations, what can we take away? And most importantly, like, how can the YIMBY movement really change and operationalize some of the feedback that we've heard? So that's some context for this. So I wanted to, I'm going to introduce Beya, and then we're going to get this started because she has a lot to share, and I'm really, really excited about this conversation. But before we do that, we have Jacob Oppenheim from Abundant Housing MA on the call to help moderate the questions in the chat. So Jacob, I just want to give you a second to, like, introduce yourself and, your background.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob. I'm not who you're here to listen to, but hopefully we'll be able to get some great questions to Beya. I'm on the board at Abundant Housing Massachusetts, and in my day job, I work running data science for a biotech company. So really excited to be here with you all because this is really important.
Okay, so Beya is the director. So I'm just gonna read, she has this, like, giant bio. I'm actually gonna read it because I think it's useful to just give you some context for this conversation, like all the different places that Beya has been, and all the things that reflect her perspective, which I've already heard a little bit of it, and I'm really excited to hear more, and hopefully you guys are too. So Beya is Director of Economic Opportunity at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and her work there focuses on economic access and equity for the business community of the Greater Boston region. She holds a master's in urban planning from Boston University, where her focus was housing and economic development. She's also a local writer on issues related to housing and racial justice. Her work can be found in the Boston Globe, Banker and Tradesman, the Bay State Banner, Dig Boston, and Travel, is it Noir? How do you pronounce that? Travel Nor, among a few others. Most recently, her op-ed in the Boston Globe, "If you support Black Lives Matter, you must support housing for all," garnered support from elected officials such as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's on the board of Lawrence Community Works and on the advocacy committee of YW Boston. In 2018, Beya led the charge for the YIMBY Town Conference in Boston and helped frame an equity agenda to better support the pro-housing conversation to include more diverse voices. So these are all top topics I have a lot of questions about. I'm sure you guys do too. Now Beya is the Vice President of the newly formed Abundant Housing MA, an umbrella agency hoping to expand the landscape of pro-housing groups throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So, big bio, lot to dig into. So. Really excited.
Thank you, Jillian.
Yeah. So let's dig into that a little bit. So tell me, this is like the background on paper, but, like, tell me from your perspective, like what got you interested in urban planning and housing issues?
Thank you, Jillian. First of all, I just want to say thank you to YIMBY Action and YIMBY Law for inviting me to this conversation. Thank you to Laura for inviting me. This is a great speaker series, and I'm so excited that we're talking about anti-racist work in the urban planning field. I think it's so important right now more than ever. I also just want to really quickly say that I know that this is a really scary time for a lot of people, many families affected by COVID-19, even those who might be listening, whether you were affected directly or indirectly, you know, we are thinking about you and we stand with you, and hopefully you're safe and healthy in your homes listening to us. I think, so it's funny when I started getting ready for this conversation, you're right. It's one of those weird things where you're like, how did I get here? And I think I've always been a very curious person by nature. So I'll talk a little bit about my experience in Lawrence because that's my hometown. And then I'll definitely pivot to Boston since I know the framing of our conversation today will most likely be around Boston. But you asked me what got me interested. So in 2012, 2013, we had a mayoral candidate running for mayor, and he hired me to be his campaign manager. And next thing you know, I was following him around, and I held very different hats since I was the only campaign staffer. I'm sure many people who've worked on campaigns can relate. You know, one day I'm the marketing manager, the other day I'm fielding calls with our volunteers. So one of the things that I got to do, which was really eye-opening for me, was to visit homes with the candidate of people who were really looking to support our campaign. Oh, there's a poll. Should we do our poll?
Go for it.
I was slow to launch it. I'm sorry.
This is hilarious. No, I love it.
Oh, it's fast.
So maybe I'll just minimize it and then we can just go to the poll. But yeah, so one of the things I got to do was visit a lot of homes and like literally meet people where they were. And I got to start thinking about just the different ways that our families in Lawrence were living. We have a very big quality of life issue in the city of Lawrence. It's a mostly immigrant community, just like my family was, a lot of first generation folks and new arrivals. So we got to hear everything from not only the challenges that they were facing with the public education system in the city, but also about the public safety that was going on. And there was a lot of crime during that time since there had been a reduction in the police force. I share all of that to say that our campaign got shaped by these stories. And one of the things that we decided to focus on was community policing. So I bring that up because look at where we are today in 2020, where we are now, like, forget police reform. Many of us are saying abolish the police, right? But again, this was 2012. We were running a campaign that was totally grassroots. I mean, we ended up winning with 59 votes. So very, very tight margin. And this is what we campaigned on. We campaigned on increasing the police force and bringing more policemen that reflected the community makeup. And I'm proud to say that the mayor has been able to meet those goals, and he's been in office for the past 6 to 7 years and has continued on that message. Why that's important is because one of the things that I recognize today is that what we really left out of that conversation was a lot of the root causes to what we were seeing. So when we talk about violence in our communities, we often don't talk about the quality of life areas like housing that we know affect how people live, how people go to work, and how our children grow up. So with the kind of understanding that I have today, I really wish that we would have talked about those issues, because now Lawrence is not only dealing with a lot of the same crime problems, but it's still dealing with a quality of life issue, specifically around housing. Lawrence is now dealing with extreme gentrification, very, very high costs, a rental market that does not reflect the needs of the local community, and many people who have been displaced or worse are now homeless because of that. And I think that, again, I'm very, very proud of the campaign that we run, because I think that it reflected the times of that, you know, where we were. And again, we were listening to what people were telling us. But I'm sure that if we would have dug a little bit deeper, we would have gotten to those root causes. And I know now that housing is definitely one of them.
Mm-hmm. Do you see, and maybe this is above your lens, but have you seen in your work a direct connection between housing and community safety specifically?
Absolutely. I think that housing is really the root cause of a lot of our societal ills. I love talking to my friends who've done public health and the idea that housing is one of the social determinants of health. So now we know that where you live truly matters in how you live and how you show up in the world. We had an influx of children who grew up with asthma. Well, now we know that the link was the lead paint that we were using in a lot of the development that was being built at a certain age in our country, right? And we're still dealing with the leading issues in some communities of color. So we know that housing is a lot of the key component to a lot of the societal issues that we care about. And that's why I decided to have that op-ed and that conversation and say, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we have to include housing because housing is an economic and racial justice issue. There's a reason why our neighborhoods look the way that they do. And it's not until we deal with that historic racism and when we deal with the real underlying causes of what led us here, we're not going to be able to move forward until we acknowledge that that is a persistent issue.
Yeah. That resonates with me a lot. I've been in nonprofit my whole career, and my last organization before UMB was a health education organization. So it was teaching young people mental and sexual health education skills, and it was like amazing. They did really great, really thoughtful work. And I got to a point where it was like, okay, we're telling these kids, for mental health issues, we're not curing their mental health problems. That's above our purview. But we're saying, like, find resources, and that's how you do it. So if you're struggling, if your friend is struggling, go find resources. But it was like a lot of these young people's communities and schools didn't have resources. Like, there were no clinics, and there were no, their school had one counselor for 500 kids, and it was just how do we this is not, you can tell this is it then becomes a bootstraps things where it's just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and those bootstraps don't exist. And so I found my way pretty quickly to housing as well. So,
and I'm so glad to have you.
Yeah, well, we likewise. So you talked about housing as racial justice. So tell me a little bit about Boston. So Boston is famously, one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview because I spent 9 years in Boston. So I experienced some of this too, and yeah,
we're gonna try to steal you back, maybe.
Yeah, I do miss the seafood, and I miss the seasons, and there's a lot I miss. Yeah, exactly. The ones with the butter and anyway. So Boston is famously known as one of the most racist cities in America. So tell me your reflections on that, and how do you think housing plays into that?
Absolutely. So fast forward, clearly I'm not in Lawrence, but I'm now in Boston, and I'm working at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, which I'm very proud to be working with them on equity and inclusion issues to support the business community here in Boston. And you're right, Boston is known for being a very racist city, and I hate to say it, but it is true. I think that unfortunately, the city has a power structure that has been slow to move, even as we see an increase of people of color moving to Boston. And there are many reports. I think the Boston Foundation did a report around millennials of color in the city of Boston and how our numbers were growing year by year. And yet the city was not able to retain us. So meaning maybe you came to Boston because of a work opportunity, or you came for one of our really famous universities, but once it came time for you to build a family, maybe you left because Boston just didn't feel like an inclusive city. So I know there's many people in my network that are working on some of these issues. One of them is called Boston While Black, which is Sheena Collier, and she's doing some great things to increase the inclusiveness of our city and really help Black young professionals stay in Boston and thrive. But one of the things that we're winning on, and it's not something that we want to win on. And Jillian, I think San Francisco is right up there. Actually, I know it is on gentrification. So there was a recent report that just came out, which I know Jacob can share the link, and it's saying that Boston is the third most gentrified city in America. I mean, again, that's not a race that we want to win, but it's the reality. And the truth is that Boston has been building more housing in the last 10 years, especially after the recession. But what's going on is that a lot of the housing that's being built isn't reflective of the need for the local community. So I'm talking about communities of color, specifically Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, which are seeing an increase in housing that doesn't fit the model that they need. So unfortunately, what's happening is that disconnect is increasing displacement in a lot of these areas. And I can even say anecdotally that a lot of friends that I know who are young professionals and who decided to start a family have not only left Boston, but they've left the state completely in order to find an affordable unit, in order to find a home if it's their first time buying a home. And that's an issue that I see as when I go to work at the chamber, I bring that up and I say, like, that's a problem for the economic growth of our region. If we're losing young talent, if we're losing young, bright people of color, and if we're losing that culture, then what's going to be left? It's not going to be much, and it's not going to be a place where people are going to want to live in.
Yeah. What about, we were talking about this yesterday, so I want to hear more of your thoughts, but like, you know, what about Back Bay? What about Beacon Hill? What about, you know, are they doing their part to build housing?
That's really funny that you bring that up. So I'm looking at the chat and I'm trying not to laugh. So it's really, really funny, right? Because Boston has this pride of this heritage, right? That a lot of people have really gravitated to. So we think of our Irish parade, like every St. Patrick's Day, which is like such a monumental event. I'm so sad that we didn't get to have it this year. But guess what? I feel like Boston, and this is where it gets its name as a racist city, it really chooses who it wants to celebrate. So it doesn't celebrate the Roxburys of the world as the Black community that had Malcolm X walking through its streets. It doesn't celebrate places like Dorchester, where there's been an influx of Vietnamese and Cambodian immigrants. I think it chooses to really celebrate who it wants to celebrate and fill in the blank. Most of the time, they don't look like me. They don't look like my friends. They don't look like the network of new people that are coming into the city and want to make it its home. So when you talk about Back Bay and you talk about these beautiful neighborhoods like Beacon Hill and others, I know Jacob, you know, was living in the South End, and it's like, well, how come those communities can't have triple deckers? How come those communities get to say no to multifamily housing? I don't think that's okay. I think that we deserve to live in any community that we choose. And that's why I decided to get involved with grassroots groups who were looking at these issues. And one of them became Abundant Housing Massachusetts.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely want to hear more about that. Yeah, I like, when I was in Boston, I lived in Cambridge actually, and which, you know, certainly also has some of these problems. I think they're a little more closer together, like they're closer pockets was my experience, but it definitely has that. And there was like, I remember we went to the South Boston St. Patrick's Day parade one year, and I went with a bunch of my roommates who lived in Cambridge, and, you know, we went down, and like, as we were going, they were like, huh, I've never been below South Station on the Red Line before. Like, this is my first time, because it's like, so there's the Red Line, it's South Station is kind of like big, you know, hub. That's where you can take the train to DC and stuff like that. And then there's South Boston, and then below that is like Dorchester and connections to Roxbury and Mattapan, and some of the historically communities of color. And you just like, it's so segregated. Like, there are people in my life who just never went there at all. Like, it just, you know, and then of course, you know, I worked in education there, and I was working for a nonprofit that was giving, that provided after school and summer program to kids in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan. So in all of those schools. And one of the things that we did was when the students aged out of the program, we tried to connect them to high performing middle and high schools in the city. And so that often meant charter schools. And I had this like crazy experience where, you know, and Boston has some really, really good charter schools. This crazy experience, and to get in, you know, they're free, they're open to the public. Like all you have to do is like write an application and then send it in, and then you can be entered into the lottery. And I was working with a Haitian Creole woman, because there was a huge population of Haitian immigrants. This was right after the earthquake, and this was in Dorchester. And we were, you know, talking to her. I had hired an interpreter, and so me and the interpreter were talking to her about how to get, you know, her children access to charter schools. And basically it came out that she had never mailed a letter before. And so she, we had to like, you know, tell her, oh no, a letter, you put the stamp on and you fill out the application, then you put it in, you put it in the mail. And it was just this crazy experience of like, holy shit, like we happened to be there to like help this woman mail a letter, and maybe that would like allow her child to get into a good school. But if we hadn't happened to be there, she would go to the neighborhood school, and like that needs to be good enough. Like that needs to be good enough. You can't just have these like, yeah, like, you know, a person happens to be there to like teach you how to mail the letter. Like it's so unsustainable. Like you need, like every school needs to be good. It's just like, so it's so sad that they're not.
It's funny that you say that, because I know a lot of my friends who are these amazing young women, and a lot of them got scholarships to high schools. And same thing, I remember a story, one of my friends who grew up in Roxbury, she's actually my roommate, and she now was able to get a scholarship to this like private school. And again, their family really, really happy that she got selected. And, you know, she had to take the bus with her friends from Roxbury into Milton. So what would happen is that she would see all of her friends, most of them Black and brown, getting off at these different stops. But by the time that they got to their destination, she was the only Black girl sitting in her bus. And I think that that's something that we could still do that today. I mean, Congresswoman Presley, during her campaign, ran this video that showed Route 28, which is, you know, it runs from Roxbury down to the rest of Boston, and you could see the change of people and the demographic. So when people say that our city is racist, I think it's talking about the segregation that is so blatant and obvious in our city. I've also had friends who have moved from other places that have larger Black populations, like Chicago and Atlanta, and they've told me their experience in Boston, where they could walk outside and go shopping and visit a restaurant, and they could never see a Black or brown person. And that's kind of scary. So that is kind of a reality. But I will say that, you know, Boston is changing. It's changing very slowly. And trust me, I often get really, really overwhelmed by the effort that we have to do together to do better. But I will say that I'm energized by the group of people who I meet and who love this city and who want to make it their home and really want to change that narrative. And I'm proud to say that what we're doing with abundant housing is one of those efforts. We saw a gap in what was in the housing world. Many of us worked for either an affordable housing developer, or at the time I was actually working at a policy agency. And I just felt like we just weren't speaking specifically to people's issues. Like I really wanted to say what I needed to say, and I wanted to call out candidates who were voting down developments in their neighborhood. And I really wanted to just be more specific and more blunt, to be honest, about what we needed. And we decided to form this group called Abundant Housing. We are a 501c4, and that's on purpose so that we can do some of that political work that I know we want to get into. But one of the things that we are doing is that we're creating organizations that are strong, that are representative of their community. And these are neighbors who are meeting in each other's homes and having dinner together and getting a strategy about the public meeting and reading zoning codes, and it just makes me so happy to learn that people care about housing in this way. And I'm excited to see what's going to happen, because I think more people are starting to say, you know what, it's not fair that I can't choose where I want to live. It's not fair that I have to choose between walking to work or having to take the car. Like, that's not okay. I think a lot of us have recognized that within this housing conversation, there's space to talk about clean energy. There's space to talk about public transit. There's space to talk about police reform or abolishing the police, which is where I stand. So I think that we're starting to create this wider net with housing at its core, and we're inviting people to the conversation.
So super exciting, and I'm really excited to see you guys take off. Yeah, we think a lot about, and the election piece is really important. I mean, we think a lot about elections at EMB Action, because it's like, we had this funny debate on one of the panels that we led, where there were people from New York, and they asked the question, like, which is more effed up, New York housing policy or San Francisco housing policy? And we were like, come on, it's definitely San Francisco. Like, are you kidding? You guys have by right permitting. Like, are you kidding? But what they said was that, like, well, you guys have in Scott Wiener, who's this big state legislator, you guys have a champion, and like he, you know, proposes these big bold solutions. And, you know, it's not just him, there's other ones. And it really is like, they put it to us, it's like, yeah, like, you know, once you get a champion in office who really cares about what you're doing, like, it makes, you know, it's so complex, like, you're never going to solve it with one law, but you could make a lot of difference if you one champion kind of pushing on all those laws. So that's like super valuable.
I'm obsessed with the idea of nurturing and creating pro-housing candidates. Like, I'm going to make that my life mission. Like, y'all will hear that now. And I say that because I really believe in the civic power of voting. And I really believe that using that as a tool is really, really important. And I think when we read books like The Color of Law, and we read and understand that a lot of these policies happen at the federal, local, and state level, where we're going to need support at every level of government to make a change and to really make a difference. I mean, economic and racial segregation, different sets of resources in our 3 years. That's crazy.
Yep. So I love all the YIMBYism you're doing now, but you started as a YIMBY skeptic. So tell me all about that. What did you think of the YIMBY movement first? Tell me everything, the dirty details, and how did your thinking evolve?
Can y'all hear me now?
Yes, you're good now.
My internet is being shady because I'm speaking the truth.
There you go.
So I was absolutely a YIMBY skeptic. I thought it was all of these nerds who just, yeah. And I just thought it wasn't a movement for me. Me meaning like the Black girl. So I just was not kind of convinced at first. I think I had seen some of the Twitter feuds between folks, actually in San Francisco, by the way.
That's fair.
And a little bit of that in Boston too. And I was a little bit turned off. But like I said, at the time I was working at a housing policy agency, and I just really wanted to do more. I was feeling really underutilized in my role, and I wanted to speak up more. And I felt almost, I swear to God, like almost like this fire burning inside of me, like I needed to do something. And at the same time, I was dealing with my own housing insecurity issues since I had left a relationship and I had decided to move back home just to save money. And I was like, what? Like, this is me, a salaried professional working in housing policy, and I can't find a place to live in Boston. Clearly, there's a problem here. So I decided to get involved with some folks who were planning this pro-housing conference, YIMBY Town. I'm sure some of you have heard of it or may have even attended some of them. So Jesse Kanson, who is now our president of Abundant Housing Mass, kind of schemed to bring me in. And it was funny because I say scheme because he's like just come to this one meeting, you know, and just hear us out. And here I am like 3 years later with these people. But at the time they were building this grassroots movement and they were trying to bring this conference to Boston to really highlight an area of need. However, they had skipped a couple of steps. They had chosen a space for the conference in a community of color. And the community bit back. They were not happy to hear that there was this huge pro-housing conference happening and that no one had talked to them about what we were planning to do. And understandably, they felt very defensive about our message and our agenda. So I, along with other friends, decided to start going to some of these grassroots groups and hear their message. And a lot of them were fighting on the displacement front. So they were based in racial justice, but were really working with at-risk renters who were either facing eviction or were facing foreclosure. So we decided to go to some of these meetings and really listen to their message. And I'm proud to say that, you know, although it seems like we were really different, at the end of the day, we were all pushing for housing. And I think that their message was definitely more about community input and making sure that the people who lived in those communities had a space in these conversations. So we decided at the YIMBY Town conference that we hosted to bring an equity planner and to really talk about redlining and to really talk about segregation and to talk about how planners could be activists within their own communities while recognizing this history. So I'm really proud that instead of being defensive or saying, you know what, we know what we're doing, or, you know, we're the ones with the degrees or whatever, we actually took a step back and humbled ourselves and said, you know what, these folks have a lot to say and they've been in this community for a very long time fighting on these issues, and we're gonna listen to them. And I think at the time, the media really tried to kind of like pit us against each other. It doesn't make for a good story when you're hearing, oh, all of these groups are suddenly getting along. So I think the media here in Boston still played us up against each other and kind of called some of them like anti-development folks. But the truth is that many of them are for this pro-housing message. They just want to make sure that we're pushing for policies that recognize the history of segregation and that recognize that, guess what? The Boston development that has often happened at the expense of Black people. And once we recognize that, then we're having a different conversation. And we're also experiencing ways to make sure that the community character that so many people love to talk about actually reflects the people who have been there and who have made it their home.
So what is the status of some of those relationships now? Are you actively working together? Are there still like ways that you're trying to build trust?
I would say yes. I think it's an ever evolving conversation. I did start shying away a little bit from the YIMBY name and start calling myself a pro-housing activist because a lot of my heart still falls in affordable housing. A lot of the folks who I know and support live in affordable housing or are still looking for those type of opportunities. And I'm also recognizing that our rental costs are through the roof and that even folks on a salaried job and with 2 incomes would still have a very, very hard time to make Boston their home. So I think that we get so caught up in some of these labels, and the truth is that the message that we need to start pushing for is making the human case for housing. So instead of just saying like, I'm a YIMBY or I'm this or whatever, I start to say like, I want to see housing for that Boston public school teacher who's making $65,000 a year. And I want to see housing for that young professional with a 6-figure income who works for a biotech company. And I want to see housing for the single parent who's on Section 8. And I want to see housing for, you know, the young professional who wants to buy a home and is a first-generation buyer. Like, that's what we need to say. And I think that when we kind of gear ourselves with all these labels and really get away from our message. So that would be what I would share. I feel like that works better than me hitting people with the data and the numbers and like, well, listen to me, like I have all these cool graphs. And it's like, no, like I don't really care about that. I just want my community to accept me and make me feel like I belong. So when I started having more of those nuanced conversations with people and really bringing the personal stories and my own lived experience, I think people started to listen a little bit more. And then I also recognized that I needed to listen.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's anything we can do to reclaim that YIMBY label where you would feel comfortable using it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, yes, in my backyard is exactly that. That's why I wrote that op-ed. I was like, I'm walking through my neighborhood and I see all of my neighbors with these like really nice homes, and most of them homeowners. And like, it's the street that's really famous in Boston is Melville Street, which is in Dorchester. And it's like this really beautiful street with these huge like mansions and like homes that are totally out of price. And all of a sudden I started to see a lot of Black Lives Matter sign. And I was like, hold up. I'm pretty sure these are the same neighbors that would show up if we decided that we wanted to bring a couple more triple deckers to the street. Like, these are the same neighbors who would fight against increasing the inclusionary development policy. Like, these are the same neighbors who would vote down multifamily zoning by right. You know what I mean? So I wanted to make that link, and I wanted to make it well known that, again, when we say Black Lives Matter, we have to also talk about housing. We have to talk about community policing, but we also have to talk about people like police killing us. Like, that's it. Like, that's what we're talking about. And you know what? At the end of the day, I want to see more housing, and I also want to see more jobs. And I want to really understand why we are here. We are here because everyone deserves a place to live, a place that's safe for them, a place that they feel is affordable to their needs. And that's really the message. And that's the one that we should be pushing for.
Mm-hmm. So I want to move to audience questions, but before that, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. So, you know, this pro-housing movement, this YIMBY movement is still, while it is increasingly diverse, it is still majority white. And what do you think about that? You know, changing that, having the white people in the movement be better allies. What are your reflections on all of that?
I would say to all of the Black and brown people listening to this call, I would say we need you. You know, you are a talent that is missing in this movement. Your lived experiences matter, and they will bring more nuance to this conversation around pro-housing. And we need you. We need you to help us plan for our future. The future of our cities depends on us. And I think that when there are more people at the table, not just people who care about housing, but again, my climate energy friends, people who care about public transit, people who are working in public health, it makes the conversation deeper, and it makes the conversation more holistic when we find ways to work together. So I would invite more of us to start showing up to these spaces and find a way to really push for policies that will make our cities better and more equitable.
And for the white people on the call, do you have,
for the white people,
yeah.
I need y'all to listen a little bit more. Like, you know, I think that this is a conversation right now that we're having that requires some humility. So I say that as even myself, like I said, when I was going to some of those racial justice meetings with some of the displacement groups in Boston, I had to sit down and listen while they yelled at us about our agenda. And I think that it requires some humility to do this work. I don't want to see the Twitter arguments anymore. Invite someone out for coffee if you don't understand their position. Invite someone to the table if you feel that they might have something to add to the conversation. Extend the opportunity, and don't wait for someone to just come and join your group. You need to go out there and see who is working on this and what groups are forming around these issues. And you'd be surprised at how much work we can do together. Again, sometimes we fill ourselves with all of these labels, and we create barriers where they don't exist. But I think it's gonna take all of us at the table to really make a change for our cities. I don't know if y'all noticed, but America is pretty much blowing up right now. Like every single day, there's a new headline that is extremely scary. So we're gonna need more of us at the table, and we're gonna need new ideas to create a new future that is more equitable and that doesn't feel like we feel today.
Yes, great. There's a lot of applause for that in the chat, so keep that coming. Let's shift to some audience questions. So Jacob, tell us what you have.
Yeah, so thank you all for your questions, trying to move to the right place. Okay, I want to start with this question from Ellen Thompson. Do you feel that there is a learning curve to use active listening skills as a planner? It seems like it isn't always included in training or education for urban planning programs. And I want to extend that a little bit for those of us who are white or come from less diverse places. You know, how do we do that? How do we do that effectively?
How do we actively listen?
And beyond that, and engage.
And engage. Well, I think that's why I say, like, go to some of these groups. So I think it's very easy for us to say, like, we have the ideas, come and join us. Well, that's why I say that we need to have some humility, because oftentimes when you think that you have a new idea, it's not new. Someone has tried it, someone is working on it, and someone is doing better at it than you are. So go find those people and go work with them and listen, absolutely. I think also beyond listening, we do have to take action. This is a time to take action. I think that what's different about this moment is the avalanche of support that I have seen for Black lives and for a new reckoning on racial justice. And I think that there is hope for our future, but it doesn't always have to include you. And what I mean by that is that there's often people of color or Black people who are leading on some of those issues, and they've been dismissed because of racist policies, or they've been dismissed because they're not the expert in the room. And I think that it is time for white people to listen to some of their Black allies and let them lead. Like, so there are conversations that white people, their position is to be the ally and not be the leaders on the front.
So on a related question, I think we've seen several people come up with various forms of the question of what are the policies that we should be advocating for that would increase the supply of housing for people that don't have it right now. I'm seeing questions around zoning codes, around barriers to housing that stop it in wealthier areas. You know, what are the things that you think are the critical pieces here?
That's a great question. I know multifamily zoning by right is a big one for us here in Massachusetts. I think that's kind of crazy that we're still fighting for that. A lot of our covenants have a lot of racial language in them still to this day in 2020. That needs to be revised. Our zoning codes are, oh my God, so outdated. That needs to be worked on. So I would definitely say zoning reform is a pretty big one.
There's also, I'll jump in on this too. We have at YIMBY Action, we have a core 4 of policies. So one is zoning reform. Let's get those like legalized multifamily. 2 is permitting reform. So make it easier. That's the by right that you mentioned. So by right would mean that you just, if you follow the rules, you get your permits. You don't have to like go through all those hearings. There's a really good book called Neighborhood Defenders that actually is research from the Boston area. So I think folks would like really, you know, resonate with a lot of what's written, but it talks about once you create this process where you have so many community meetings for every development, who shows up? It's like, who shows up? Who do you think? It's like, it's like older white people, homeowners, and people who like really benefit from the development not being built versus all those people who could live in that development who are not represented in that process. So permitting, you know, community input needs to happen, and it should happen up front. I mean, ideally, and this is tricky, and this is where we
Jillian, you froze for me. I'm telling you, my FBI agent is hacking this conversation. Jacob, why don't we move to another question?
Yeah, all right. I'll
Talking
jump
about
to another
building.
question right here. Okay, here's another question. What do you, that I'm going to expand a little bit here. What are the differences in how Boston housing is changing versus the neighboring towns? Are there different reforms that are necessary for different locations?
Oh, oh my God, that is such a good question. Whoever asked that, thank you. One of the things that we're always pushing for is that Boston is actually doing its fair share of building and permitting new developments, but we need the suburbs around the greater Boston area to do its part. We're really lucky in Massachusetts to have 40B, which requires at least 10% of affordable housing, of all development to be affordable housing. However, we need to go beyond that, and there's still communities that either only meet the 10% threshold or are just under it. Hey, Jillian.
Sorry about that.
No
Good time to have the internet. I hope you moved to a new question. So
yeah, we did.
Okay, great.
So I'm sharing about Chapter 40B, which is a pretty great law that we have here in Massachusetts that requires 10% of all development to be affordable housing, but we need way more than that. There's the Newtons of the world that need to build more housing, and my friends at Engine 6 are doing a great job of making sure that that happens. But I also want to see other communities really building at the level that they need to. And then that's when we will see less pressure in areas like Boston, like Cambridge, like Somerville. When we have other communities building at higher levels, then we will just see a less of an increase on, less of that pressure and demand. And again, I think that a lot of folks would love to live in some of those communities, and they should think about opening their doors and welcoming young people, welcoming new families, welcoming new immigrants. But guess what? Oftentimes they're closing the doors. When you don't build new housing, you're essentially closing the door on new people to coming in.
And you're not against luxury housing either.
No, I'm not. That's why I always say housing for all. Like, you know what? That millionaire, he's going to live somewhere and he's going to want to live in Boston. So I don't want to compete with him. I don't want to compete with him. He's going to win every time. So we need to build luxury. We need to build middle for that family that needs it. And we need to build for low income families, because we all deserve to live in great places.
Yeah. And core 4, sorry, it said zoning is one, permitting reform is another. The one I cut off was funding for subsidized affordable. So we do need housing at all levels. However, the housing for the affordable levels is not going to get built by itself. We need funding for that. We need public funding sources. So that's a big thing that we support. And then we also have a category of bad incentives. Here in California, we have some like super fucked up tax incentives that make it really hard for cities to build housing. Every region has those. So there's kind of another category of mostly like tax incentives that make it easier. So we think about those. And I know that's similar to what you guys are thinking about too.
Another thing on my wish list, I would love to see a renter's tax credit. I mean, we have, homeowners get a huge tax credit. And I know that in the book Evicted, Matt Desmond notes that that's a huge subsidy that homeowners get. Well, why can't renters get the same? Like, come on. I feel like that's what would make this more equitable. It would make us really feel, oftentimes renters move themselves away from participating in the public process or being engaged in their local neighborhood. And it's often because they feel like they don't belong. I've talked to renters who've lived in their communities for 10 plus years and still feel that because they don't own a home in the area, that they don't belong in some of those community meetings. And I think that if we were to look at policies that would help shift that narrative, a renter's tax credit could do that.
Okay, great. So I think there's 2 questions I'd love to ask you, Beya, about messaging. So one is about the charts. So how do we convince more pro-housing YIMBY activists to put down the data and charts as a form of persuasion and instead pick up the tools of storytelling and making human-centered narratives, the core building block of our activism and our work in dismantling exclusionary housing policy? That was a very well-worded question.
I was gonna say, like, yo, like they went in. Okay, thank you. I think what I got from that is that I did say that we need to make the human case for housing. again, we get so caught up in our lingo, like, you know, 80% AMI or whatever. But you know what? We just need to make the human case for housing. Like, talk about who you're talking about, you know, make it personal. Tell us your housing story. Like, I would love to know, what was the most affordable place you lived? What did you love about it? Like, what do you love about your neighborhood? Like, what makes you want to live somewhere? Like, those are the conversations that I'd rather have. And don't get me wrong, there is space for the data. And actually, when we do both, that's when we really make our argument strong. So when I tell my housing story and I share my lived experience and I share that with data too, oh my God, like we got a winning model. And I'm not gonna front, I don't think it's easy to do that. I think it's very, very difficult. I've had plenty of friends share their experiences of showing up at a community meeting in support of affordable housing and getting booed, literally, or being called names because of them exercising their right. So I think, I'm not gonna say that it's easy, but I think it brings us closer when we share who we are, because I think the beauty of neighborhoods that have a diverse makeup is that you see all of the different people finding a place to live, finding a place to make their home. And we know that more inclusive neighborhoods and more inclusive cities thrive better. People want to live in communities where they feel like they belong. And they'll make the exception to go there. So yeah, we just got to work on that a little bit more.
Okay, another question related to this is, how do you deal with the people who have those Black Lives Matter signs next to signs opposing affordable housing developments? How do you have those conversations?
Can you repeat the question?
So I'll read the whole one. How do you have the pro-housing conversation with your friends, family, neighbors who already believe Black Lives Matter but oppose any new development? People usually don't like being told, well, if you actually believe Black Lives Matter, you'd support X, Y, and Z.
That's really interesting. I think that we need to elevate the housing conversation at every level. So yes, talk about it in your office, talk about it in the boardroom, talk about it with your neighbors and your families. I think that we have to make the human case for housing. We need to fill out the census so we get an accurate count for our cities to operate at the level that they need to reach every household. We need to vet candidates on their housing policies. And we just need to continue to elevate the housing conversation at every level of government.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add to that, so Beya did write a great op-ed, Laura pointed out, about if you believe in Black Lives Matter. It's just posted in the chat, so check that out. And I would make a call. I'm a white person, and you know, to some extent, if white people are in your life, if you're a white person and white people in your life are doing that, you know, don't put the burden on people of color to like speak up to those, you know, do it. Say, hey, I think it's really cool that you're thinking about Black Lives Matter. And I have one of the ways I have taken anti-racism to heart is to think about who am I letting into my community and how am I reckoning with the fact that white people have for centuries stopped people of color from coming into their communities. And that's why we have these staggering problems, and we can do better. And what do you think about joining me in doing better? That's the type of thing. So white people, let's do that to other white people.
Absolutely. And there's so many resources available now. There's so many great books I'm happy to share after our talk. I've had to educate myself. Planning school didn't teach me about redlining. Planning school didn't teach me about segregation. I had to go and teach myself. I had to go and make that an effort that I wanted to be closer to. So I think that it takes all of us recognizing that our history books weren't fair to us and there was only a one-sided story. And I think I'm happy to hear many people, not just white people, starting to say, you know what, there's more about this issue that I didn't understand, and I'm willing to educate myself.
So another question that touches on something.
Jacob, I'm going to interrupt you. Let's just do one more question and then we'll wrap up because I know we're at time. So we'll do one more question and then we can wrap up with like just some final calls to action. So pick a good one.
Sounds good. I have a provocative one for something Beya touched on at the beginning, which is, what would a reparations policy look like in housing?
Ooh, I love that question. First of all, Asheville, North Carolina just passed reparations for all of its Black residents. That's amazing. That's anti-racist policy. Um, I think, I don't want to get too deep on this because we only have a minute. I would say there's a great piece that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about called "The Case for Reparations," and he wrote about it a couple of years ago. And I would encourage everyone to read that piece because I think that there is a case for reparations right now. I think our Black residents deserve that, and I think that if you're a person of African descent who grew up in this country and can trace your lineage, your family has suffered enough, and it might be time for America to pay its debt.
Love it. So want to wrap up. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to continue, YIMBY Action, we have a community of 20,000 activists growing across the country, and we'd love to invite you to join our movement. YIMBYaction.org/join is how you can do that. And we are continuing this conversation. We have some speakers that we'll announce very soon in this Making Urbanism Anti-Racist. If you have an idea of a speaker, email us, let us know. We'd love to get them on this discussion. And then actually next week, next Thursday, the 23rd, me and then Laura and Ernest and Sam, who've been the moderators of the previous conversations, we're gonna have like a highlights reel conversation where we talk about what we've learned. We're gonna kind of internalize some of the lessons. We're gonna think about like, all right, Beya told us to stop arguing on Twitter and use less charts. How can we do that? How can we actually make that happen? So tune in next week to kind of think about like from what we've learned so far, it's not the end, but from what we learned so far, what's next as a future step. So those are my calls to action, but Beya, like close us out. What are your calls to action for the audience?
I tried to say them across, but I think we need to vote in this fall's election. Please go vote. We need to elevate the housing conversation at every level of government. We need to vet candidates on their housing policies, start asking those questions and get specific. We need to fill out the census so we get the accurate count for all of our cities. And we need to speak up in every household, in our offices, in our boardrooms, in our homes, and we need to make the human case for housing.
Love it. Well said. We'll leave you with that. Thank you all so much. Excited to have more conversations. Thank you to Beya. Thank you to Jacob. This was incredible. It'll be on YouTube tomorrow, so rewatch it. And cheers. See you guys. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you guys.